This week's parsha discusses the issue of Tumah and Tahara, ritual impurity and ritual purity. Very, very difficult concept, unfamiliar concept. Its relevance really is more in the time that the Beis Hamikdash stood, with a person in a state of Tumah was not allowed to enter the temple, was not allowed to partake of the sacrifices. A person in a state of Tara was permitted. So really the relevance of the application of the laws of Tumah and Tara is really related to the temple. Nowadays we have no Beis Hamikdash, so these laws aren't practiced, and therefore they're difficult to relate to. But nevertheless there are lessons to be derived. The first section is perhaps one of the most difficult ones, just a very short section, which deals with the tumah of the childbearing woman. And of course the detail which stands out is the difference between a mother who gives birth to a male child and a female child. We'll touch on that. In this impurity there are two stages. There's an initial stage, which is a intense period of impurity. And then there is a secondary stage where the laws are somewhat more lenient. In the case of a mother giving birth to a male, the initial stage is 7 days, and the second stage is 33 days, for a total of 40. In the case of a woman who gives birth to a female child, the initial stage is 14, and the subsequent stage is 66, leading to a total of 80 days. So of course that detail stands out, that our boys different than girls, or girls different than boys. Perhaps we'll address that too. But the very idea of tumas yoledes, that a yoledes should be impure, is very hard to understand. Because what type of impurity should be associated with the process of giving birth, the miraculous process of giving birth? So we'll talk about that too. Now the Torah says that at the conclusion of this period of impurity, so the woman is obligated to bring sacrifices, and these sacrifices in turn permit her to enter the temple and to partake of the meat of sacrifices. And the Torah says that the requisite korban is a lamb as an olah, as a burnt offering, and a bird as a chatas, as a sin offering. And if the woman is not of means, she can't afford it, so instead of the sheep and a bird, she brings 2 birds. One as an olah, one as a burnt offering, and the other as a chatas. And here again the question is that why a sin offering? Here the question is compounded. Until now we're dealing with a question of tumah, a state of ritual impurity. Okay, that itself is hard to understand. But a chatas is a korban that's associated with a sin. Like, what sin did the childbearing woman commit? Well, the Talmud says a very fascinating thing. It says that the woman in her labor pains swears that she will no longer live with her husband. She doesn't want to go through this again. Now that oath is not a binding oath, because part of the marriage contract is the mutual obligation to one another. Because if a husband swears that he will not have relations with his wife, or if a wife swears she will not have relations with her husband, that oath is not a binding oath, because each is meshubad, each is really beholden to the other by virtue of their marriage contract. So the oath doesn't take effect yet. The mere fact that you think of making such an oath calls for a atonement, and therefore you bring the korban chatas. That's what Chazal say. Very, very perplexing. And the truth is that although the Gemara gives this reason, there are other places in the Gemara where the Gemara doesn't seem to understand that the chatas of the yoledes is an atonement. And the Gemara in Nedarim explicitly says that there's a distinction between what is called chatas chelev and chatas yoledes. Chatas chelev is the general korban chatas, which is brought for a range of sins, but first and foremost is the sin of eating the forbidden fat of an animal, which is kares, sin. And the Torah says that chatas chelev ko'asya lekapara. That chatas comes for atonement. Chatas yoledes lo asya lekapara. It doesn't come for atonement. So the Gemara here in the Darm seems to go counter to the other Gemara, which is a Maseches Nida, which seems to say that there is an element of atonement in the case of the Yoledis. The Gemara in the Darm seems to say that it's not. It's not an atonement at all. It's simply to permit her to eat kachim. So it's hard to understand. So if it's not an atonement, so exactly what is it? Now, if I can trouble you with a detail, a very, very technical detail, but it might be telling. But forgive me that we're going to kind of get bogged down in a technicality. Now, the Torah here says that if the woman has means, financial means, she brings a certain sacrifice. If she doesn't, she brings a lesser sacrifice. Now, this halacha we have in other places in the Torah. Notice, for example, in Parashas Vayikra, we speak about a type of carbon. It's a type of carbon chatas, which is called a carbon olev yored. It goes up and down on a sliding scale, depending on the person's means. But there's a very subtle difference between that instance and this instance. See, the Torah there says the following. The Torah says if a person committed one of those sins, so if the person is wealthy, he simply brings a carbon chatas, either a sheep or a goat as a carbon chatas. If the person can't afford a sheep or a goat, then the person brings two birds, one as a chatas and one as a ola. So the chatas and the ola, the bird chatas and the bird ola, are coming to replace the single animal chatas. In other words, this sin calls for a sheep or a goat as a chatas. You replace the chatas with two birds, of which one is a chatas and one is an ola. It's just a little perplexing. If really you should bring a chatas, why do you have to replace the chatas with a chatas and an ola? Now you find this in another instance. In Parshas Naso, in the case of a Nazir, who brings korbanos okay, that aside. But there is a famous Rashba. The Rashba says like this. The Rashba says normally when you bring a carbon, there are two components to the carbon. The blood is sprinkled on the altar. The fat is burnt on the mizbeach. Now, in the case of a chatas ha'oif, a sin offering of a bird, Chazal say, Ein le-mizbeach el-adam. The only thing the altar gets is the blood. There is no fat of the bird that is burnt on the altar. Birds don't have chaylev. So the Rashba says this is why a chatas of an animal has to be replaced by two birds. Because if you bring a chatas of an animal, so there is the blood offered on the mizbeach and the fat which is burnt in the mizbeach. But if you can't afford the animals, now you're bringing birds instead. So you have to have something which has the blood on the altar as a chatas and something which is burnt on the mizbeach. That's why you bring the ola of the bird. You bring the ola of the bird to replace the fat of the animal that would have been burnt on the mizbeach. And that's why the replacement for an animal chatas is two birds. One as a chatas, that's to replace the blood of the animal chatas, and the ola is to replace the fat of the animal chatas. So therefore, going back to the case of the ola v'yored, really the fundamental obligation is a chatas. Is a chatas. If you can't afford a sheep or a goat, you replace the chatas with two birds. The ola, therefore, is not really an ola per se. The ola is a replacement for the fat of the chatas. In the case of the yoledes, it's different. In the case of the yoledes, if she has means, she brings two sacrifices. She brings an ola and a chatas. If she's poor, she brings two birds, an ola and a chatas. So here, the ola of the bird is not a replacement for the chatas. The ola is a replacement for the ola. Now, in the case of the yoledes, I know this is a very technical point. I don't know if your eyes are raising over, but it's a technical point. But I think it's a very, very important point. Because in the case of the carbon ola v'yored, the bird, which is an ola, is a replacement for a component of the chatas. In the case of the yoledes, the bird ola is a replacement for the ola. Now, this explains a very interesting thing. That if you go back over there, in the case of ola v'yored, the Torah tells us you bring the two birds, the first is the chatas and the second is an ola. Right? Here it says, you bring the two birds, you bring the ola, the first as an ola and the second as a chatas. Now the Gemara says that in halacha there's no difference. Really, you always bring a chatas before an ola. But why does the Torah put it differently? Well, the answer is very simple. You see, by the case of the carbon ola v'yored, the ola is a replacement for the chatas. So of course, thematically, you have to say the fundamental obligation is a chatas. You can't afford a goat or a sheep. You bring the bird as a chatas. What is the ola for? The ola is to replace a component of the chatas. So of course, you don't put the ola before the chatas. The ola is secondary to the chatas. Really, the obligation is to bring a chatas. The ola is to replace a part of the chatas. So when you presented this, you bring a bird as a chatas, and then you bring a bird as an ola to replace the missing component of the chatas. Here, in the case of the yoledes, the obligation is to bring an ola and a chatas. So when you replace it with two birds, the first is an ola, the second is a chatas. And the question is, so why over here is there an ola? In other words, it comes out that it's not just that she has committed a sin, but there is some other aspect which seems to necessitate a ola. Now it's very interesting. You may remember we talked about this in the past. The Gemara says that an ola is mechaper for hirur halev. An ola is mechaper for illicit thoughts. And according to the Gemara, that says that really the sin in question is the sin of swearing, at least in her mind. So that's perhaps an illicit thought that calls for a korban ola. Perhaps that explains it. But let's tackle this from another angle. Let's see if we can understand something fundamental about Sumas Yoledes and perhaps the idea of these korbanos. Rabbeinu Bechaya says a very, very strange thing here. Rabbeinu Bechaya says that these sacrifices are not to atone for anything that this particular woman did. These sacrifices are to atone for the sin of the first mother of all mankind, which is Chava. That's what Rabbi Eliezer says. That these sacrifices are to atone for the sin of Chava. Why should this particular woman have to atone for the sin that her great-great-great-grandmother committed? So Rabbi Eliezer gives a hint, but we have to flesh out the details. He says, because really there is a problem with the birth of every child. The problem with the birth of every child is that the birth of a child is a consequence of desire. Right? Men and women have a desire for one another, and as a consequence, they have children. You know, it's very, very interesting that we have, in a sense, at our own peril, we have disconnected reproduction from desire through artificial contraception. So you can have your cake and eat it too, so to speak, right? A person can fulfill his or her desire and not bring children into the world. The consequence of that, of course, is the birth dearth, as opposed to the baby boom. Now, we are not reproducing at even replacement rates. But in theory, before artificial contraception was effective, so every child that was brought into the world was not necessarily a consequence of a conscious decision to have children, but rather was often the case a consequence of having succumbed to desire. Men and women have a desire, and this child is the consequence of that. Desire, says Rabbeinu Bechaya in Parshas Bereishis, is something which Chava brought into the world. Her role in the sin in the Garden of Eden created desire. Now let's understand exactly what this means. Now, the Rishonim all explain that before the chet of the Eitz Hadas, man did not operate in response to desire. Because people were created in such a way that they would act as a function of reason. Every decision they would make would be a reasoned one, thought through philosophically, what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is evil, and would act accordingly. There was no such thing as succumbing to desire, to an urge, to a passion. And this is the meaning of the Rashi in Chumash that says that before the chet of the Eitz Hadas, there was no Yetzer Hara. Doesn't mean we were robots. We certainly had free will. Otherwise, the sin couldn't have been performed. But there was no such thing as succumbing to passion, to desire, to an urge. Because every decision was reasoned. There were pros, there were cons, they were weighed. A person could make a mistake. A person could miscalculate and end up doing the wrong thing. In fact, many commentaries understand that the chet of the Eitz Hadas itself was such a miscalculation. The Adam Rishon just made a mistake. He didn't think it through as he should have. But the idea of having this urge that you can't say no to, that was the consequence of the chet of the Eitz Hadas. Now, we often think that it was some like consequence of eating the fruit that created desire. And by the way, the symbolism of eating is very, very appropriate, because eating symbolizes internalizing something which was previously external, right now becomes a part of you. So the urge, the desire, which is internal, is introduced through the process of eating, a psychological insight. But Rabbeinu Bechaya says something very surprising. We'll discuss this more at length in Parshas Bereishis, that really the cause of the sin was desire. If you look in the verses, it says that Chava saw the fruit and she had a desire for the fruit. Meaning there was one thing in the world that could arouse desire, and that was the fruit. Because she succumbed to that desire, she introduced into herself a desire for everything else. But there was one thing that was desirable even before the sin, and that was the forbidden fruit itself. If Chava would have taken precautions, she would not have succumbed to that desire. But when the Nachash showed it to her and praised it to her, and she looked at it and she said, this is pretty good, and she was interested and she had a desire, so she ate it, and as a result, desire for everything else was introduced. The Rishonim, as far as others, the Ramban, point out a very interesting thing. That we know the first consequence of the chet was the realization that they had no clothes. And they took very large fig leaves and they made, I guess you could say, aprons that would cover their private parts, so to speak. So the question is, what does that mean? Beforehand, there was no need for clothing. So they say exactly that. What is the shame associated with the reproductive organs? The shame is, it's embarrassing. It's an embarrassment when a person shows that he is acting in self-interest as opposed to acting altruistically. You know, I'll give you an example of a joke, right? Jokes are telling. You know, the story is told there was once a Hanukkah party, and there's a plate of latkes, and everyone took latkes, and there are 2 latkes left. And everyone is sitting around the table eyeing these latkes. And no one wants to take one of the last 2 latkes. And everyone is looking and looking and looking. The 2 latkes are there. There's a big crowd. And all of a sudden, the lights go out. And a second later, there is a blood-curdling scream. There's one person with his hand on the latke. Another person has a fork stuck into his hand. Now, let's understand what's going on in the joke. You know, everyone wants to present himself as being an exemplar of moderation. You know, I don't succumb to desire. I don't stuff my face. You know, I eat in a measured way, and so on and so forth. I certainly wouldn't take the last latke. You know, but we all want that last latke. So we don't make a grab for it until the lights go out, so you won't be embarrassed. Right? But imagine the person who would take that last latke while the lights were on. What would people say about that guy? Reminds me of another joke. There were 2 fellows sitting, and there were 2 pieces of cake. There was a big piece and a small piece. So the first person takes the big piece. And he says, "Hey, what are you doing taking the big piece?" It's not nice taking the big piece. So he says, "Well, if you would have taken the first one, what would you have taken?" He said, "I would have taken the smaller piece." So, well, that's what you got. What are you complaining about? But the point is, we never want to present ourselves as being, you know, being a chazer, so to speak. You know, a fresser, a person who takes, who eats. In moderation. But the idea, it's an embarrassment when we show that we can't control our desire. All right, so we want to present ourselves as being measured. You know, take a little morsel. You know, that's enough for me. I don't need more than that. But to show that we just can't control, we're out of control. That's an embarrassment. The area of sexuality is one of those areas. Right? There's a shame associated with the sexual organs, precisely because that is the area where we are least in control. So this is the area where we are most tempted to succumb to passion, desire, to the Yetzirah, so to speak. And therefore, these parts of the body become, it's like we don't even want to admit that we have them. You know, I'm a eunuch. I don't even have these organs. You know, I'm covered up. You know, I'm like an angel. You know, that's the idea behind it. But that was only necessary after the Chet. Before the Chet, where there was no desire, so if people would reproduce, it would be dutiful. No, we have to perpetuate the human race. It's the right thing. This is what we're going to do. Yeah. Now, the idea of desire, succumbing to desire, that was introduced by the Chet. Therefore, the embarrassment is introduced then as well. And that's why Adam and Chava, the first thing they feel compelled to do is to cover themselves up. So Chava introduced desire to the world. And as a consequence, every child, virtually every child, is brought into the world as a consequence of desire. And therefore, we have to atone for that, says Rabbi Eliezer. And therefore, that's why the woman brings these korbanos. This is the very cryptic comment of Rabbi Eliezer. I don't know if this is what he means, because again, it's hard to understand. If the sin in question is bringing desire into the world, that's Chava's fault. That's not the fault of this poor woman many generations later. I'd like to understand it this way. You know, there's a very interesting verse going back to Parshas Bereishis. It says that as a consequence of the Chet of the Eitz Hadas, Hashem tells Chava, Harba Arbe, Itzvoneich v'heroneich, ve'etzem tel dibonim. That as a consequence of the sin, I will increase your pain, the pain of conception, that be'etzav and sadness that you will give birth to children. So Chazal say there are three elements of discomfort that were introduced here. The first is tsar gidul bonim, the pain of raising children. The second is the pain of pregnancy, discomfort of pregnancy. And the third is the pain of giving birth, of labor. So this was all a consequence of the chet. First of all, we have to understand what this means. It's hard to mention it's a punishment. It was a punishment, again, it should be a punishment to Chava alone. But since all her descendants are equally affected, we're not talking about a punishment as much as a consequence. Somehow the consequence of Chava's chet is that raising children, giving birth to children, etc., is going to involve pain. Now, why should that be? Number two, the order is very odd. It puts the pain of gidul banim, of raising children, before the pain of pregnancy and birth. The order should be the pain of pregnancy, birth, and then raising children. That's the normal order. One of the ingenious answers given to this question, by the way, is the fact that at this point, according to Chazal, despite the fact that Psukim have a different order, Cain and Hevel already were born. So she already had children, so she would have to raise them, and only then she would have the experience of pain of pregnancy and birth with her next children. Okay, that's a clever interpretation, but it doesn't seem to satisfy the fundamental problem. The idea is as follows. Chazals tell us that before the chet of Adam Harishon, it wasn't that raising children was painless. There was no tsar gidul banim. There was no pain of raising children. If not for the chet, there'd be no raising of children. Chazal that say that Cain and Hevel were born before the chet say an amazing thing. That Shnayim olu lemita v'arba yordu. Chava and Adam went to the bed, and 4 people emerged. The 2 of them and their 2 children. Meaning, conception, pregnancy, birth was immediate, and Cain and Hevel were born fully matured. I can't imagine fully grown, because it's hard to imagine a woman carrying a full-sized adult. But the process was very, very swift. Meaning, there was no extended period of childbearing. When Chazal say that the consequence of the chet is tsar gidul banim, it isn't, again, that previously raising children was easy and now it becomes difficult. It means that if not for the chet, there would have been no process of raising children. You wouldn't have to raise your children. The reason we have to raise our children is a consequence of the chet. Why is that? Well, think about it for a second. Because Chazal tell us that there are 2 forces within a human being. Right? There's the Yetzer Tov and there's the Yetzer Hara. In Kehelas, the Yetzer Hara is called Melech Zaken Uksil, an old, foolish king. The Yetzer Tov is called Yeled Chacham Umiskein, a wise child, an unfortunate wise child. So the Medrash says, why is the Yetzer Hara called a foolish old king? And why is the Yetzer Tov called a young, wise child? A wise child, but unfortunate. So the Gemara is like this. The Yetzer Hara has an advantage. The Yetzer Hara comes at birth. As soon as you're born, you have a Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Tov only is introduced when the person is bar mitzvah. That's what the Gemara says. So therefore the Yetzer Hara is much older than the Yetzer Tov. So by comparison, the Yetzer Hara is called a Melech Zaken Usil, old foolish king. He's foolish because advocating evil is foolish. And the Yetzer Tov is a newcomer. So he's a Yeled, he's a child. So Chacham is very wise, but he's miskin. He's very unfortunate. Why is he unfortunate? No one listens to him. Right? He warns. No one pays attention. So he's a Yeled, Chacham, and miskin. The idea is as follows. That we're talking about the Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara is not a psychological urge to evil. No, maybe a psychopath has that phenomenon. The Yetzer Hara is nothing more than the natural desires that a human being has. A person wants pleasure, a person wants comfort, a person wants variety, fun. emotional gratification, honor, etc. That's what the Yetzer Hara means. It's not necessarily evil. It can be evil because if it is not restrained, directed, guided, it can lead a person to evil. Hunger for food is a very important thing. If the people would not have a natural hunger for food, people would just die of malnutrition without realizing it. Like imagine that, all of a sudden a person collapses from starvation. And you ask him, well, why did you eat? He says, I forgot to eat. What do you mean you forgot to eat? You can't forget to eat. Why can't you forget to eat? Because there's a natural urge to eat. There's a hunger. Right? Before you come to that, you'll eat. Right? We forget to take our medicine because there's no natural desire for our medicine. So after you take your antibiotics for a few days, you stop taking them. You feel better. You don't remember to take them because there is no natural urge to take your medicine. But food is a natural urge. It's very, very good for a person that, right? People need that reminder. But if that urge for food is not properly directed, you will steal to eat, you will cannibalize to eat. It can lead a person to terrible evils. So therefore, the natural desires, that's what Chazal are speaking about when they talk about the Yetzer Hara. What is the Yetzer Tov? The Yetzer Tov is the intelligence, is the seichel, the common sense, the reason, which guides and controls, directs the Yetzer Hara. It takes a long time to develop that. It isn't a gift. These are things you have to learn. You have to be trained in. So before there was desire, there was no need for an extended period of childbearing. Because you didn't need das, you didn't need intelligence, you didn't need reason to balance and offset desire. But once desire was introduced as a consequence of the Yetzer Hara, so now we have to have the Yetzer Tov, so to speak, which is the Yeled Chacham, the wise child. You have to have das, you have to have intelligence, you have to have reason, you have to have common sense. That takes a long time to learn. So that's why there's an extended period of childbearing. Until you're 13, you don't have it at all. Because I'll say not a bardas. Right? Doesn't mean that you'll always do the wrong thing. But what it does mean that you won't necessarily do the right thing consistently. Because you don't have that capacity to exercise reason to the extent that you will, as a rule, do the right thing. Because when the situation is easily dealt with, you do the right thing. When the situation is a little tempting, you'll give in. Because when a person reaches the age of das, and by the 13 is just a standard measure. I think that there are some people that don't have it even at 20. And there may be some people that have it at 11. But the laws of the Torah have to deal with the averages. The Torah says, okay, 13 is the measure. But when a person reaches that stage of das, then the presumption is he has enough intelligence, reason, common sense to be able to consistently decide to do the right thing. But that has to be trained. And by the way, the chinuch, the training of the person, doesn't end with becoming 13. That's when he has the full set of tools in his tool chest that can be sharpened for use. So the chinuch only begins in the childhood years, but it has to extend beyond the childhood years as well. Well, in that, there are ups and downs, there are setbacks. In other words, it's not always an uphill climb of nahas and satisfaction. As kids, we make big mistakes. Leave the beaver. Is the documentary evidence of that for those who are of a certain era. So, the younger people have no clue, right? You know what I'm talking about. That's old guys, you remember, right?
The beaver.
Wally and the beaver. Anyway, so the point is this: that takes a long time. It takes a long time, right? That's tsar gilbon. That's the pain of raising children. Right? The pain of raising children is the frustration of the things that they can do, which are so stupid, right? So frustrating, right? When you you try and you teach and you guide and you try to inspire and direct them, and then yet sometimes they can just surprise you with their antics. That's painful. The Tsar Gidul Banim is not changing diapers. That's just an unpleasant duty. There's some parents even enjoy doing it, right? But the real pain of raising children is the frustration of just like, how could you do a thing like that? That's Tsar Gidul Banim. Now, that's the consequence of the chet. The consequence of the chet is you introduce desire into the world, and now you have to pay the price. The price of introducing desire is now you have to raise children and develop in them the intelligence, the common sense, to be able to out-reason desire. So Tsar Gidul Banim is not a punishment for the chet as much as it is a consequence of the chet. Right? You bring desire into the world. Now you have to deal with the consequence. That's Tsar Gidul Banim. Now the interesting thing over here is that the duty falls primarily on mother, and this is also a fact, right? That the primary teacher of children is mother. Sounds unfair, but this happens to be the fact. Fathers are doing whatever they're doing. They're in the office, right? And mothers are the ones who are really directing their children, raising their children, and so on and so forth. But the question is that what prepares a mother for that role? In other words, she gives birth to this child. Why does she have such an investment in this child, such an interest in this child? The answer is Rebbeinu Shalom in his Chachma created a situation where a mother has a major investment in the child even before the child is born. Fathers, and this is something which as fathers we all experience, right? If you go back to the olden days, it used to be the fathers were in the waiting room of the hospital waiting for the child to be born. They couldn't go in, and sterile delivery room. The fathers were there, either pacing the floor, reading the newspaper, whatever they're doing, as the case may be. And the nurse would come out, and Mr. Such and Such, I'm proud to tell you, you have a baby boy. Congratulations. And so happy to have a boy or a girl, whatever it is. But the truth is, the father felt very much estranged.
Passed out cigars.
He's not he's not involved in the process. It's almost like this is not his child in some sense. Obviously it's his child in a purely biological sense. He made some contribution, but he has very little at that point invested in this child. So now, artificially, we try to create these things. The father should be there in the delivery room, and he's helping, and but when you think about it for a second, you realize it's all really just an attempt to artificially create a reality which is not real. This is a fact that mothers have a much greater attachment to that child from the moment of birth than their fathers do. And that's a consequence of the fact that the mother has given so much, and she has suffered so much for that child. By the time the child is born, she's already gone through months and months and months of labor, hard work in the production of that child. So as soon as the child is born, the mother has a much greater investment, and that's why she has the momentum to function as a mother and do all that she has to do, because it already started beforehand. That's what the Torah puts in that order. In other words, the real consequence of the chet is the first thing. Harba arbe itzvanech. I will increase the pain of raising children. That is the real consequence of the chet. But in order that she should have the momentum to discharge that duty, therefore HaKadosh Baruch Hu created a situation where she has so much invested in the child beforehand, through the pregnancy and through the labor itself, that this is her child in a way that it's not to the father.
So the first children wouldn't have had that?
The first one won't have that. Cain and Abel were fully born. They didn't have any.
So they would have equal connection to their parents.
Now, now we can begin to understand a little bit what's going on in this parsha of the Yoledes. Let me share with you a Rambam, a wording of the Rambam. The Rambam says an amazing thing. And I'll give you a mushal that will illustrate it. The Rambam raises a very interesting question. Who is more pure? A person who never became Tameh in his life, or a person who became Tameh and went through the process of purification, went to the mikveh and so on and so forth? Who is more pure? Well, we would have said both the same, no different. So the Rambam says a fascinating thing. There's a halacha by the Parah Aduma. The Torah says that the procedure for the Parah Aduma has to be performed by an Ish Tohor, a pure person. And Chazal say that means a person who became Tameh and was purified. It's full yoy. Not a person who always was pure. It's a person who was Tameh and became pure. So the Rambam says, because if the Torah testifies that the person is an Ish Tohor, that is more properly applied to a person who was Tameh and purified himself than a person who never became Tameh. If the Torah says that the person is Tohor, that means he was Tameh and became pure. Which is a fascinating thing when you think about it. Now, a person who never became Tameh is pure by virtue of the fact that he never was defiled. But a person who was defiled and then purified himself is pure by virtue of his own struggle, his own effort, his own labor. That's, in a sense, a higher level of purity. It seems over here that the impurity of the Yoledes is not because she did something which is unclean or she came in contact with something unclean. It's because the Torah wants her to prepare herself for a mission. And therefore the Torah says, we're going to impose upon you a state of impurity so that you will emerge from that state at a higher level of purity than you were beforehand. That's what the Torah wants. What is this comparable to? I don't know if they still do this, but when I was a kid, and they wanted to impress upon us what a poor job we were doing brushing our teeth. So they had these pills you could chew that would color the plaque on your teeth, and your teeth would be red. And despite the fact that you brushed your teeth that morning, you would discover what a poor job you did, and then you'd go and brush it off, and your teeth would really be clean. Now, the idea is that sometimes to create a true state of purity, you have to be defiled and then purify yourself. That is the idea behind the Tumas Yoledes. Tumas Yoledes is because the Torah is preparing the Yoledes for a very, very lofty function, very, very high function, very important function. She's going to be the primary caretaker of this child. And therefore we want to elevate her to a very high level of purity, a very high level of Kedusha, to prepare her for that function. So how do we do that? The Torah, in an artificial way, says we're going to create a impurity, which in turn she will rectify through the immersion and through the bringing of sacrifices. And this will raise her to a level of purity where she'll be better prepared to fulfill this mission, which is placed upon her, of raising this child. Now we can begin to understand the amazing insight that Rav Hirsch gives in his explanation of the difference between the mother who gives birth to a male child, who gives birth to a female child. He says very simply. He says that in raising a child there are two aspects to what the parent does. First of all, the parent communicates to the child and speaks to the child and admonishes the child and so on and so forth. But secondly, the parent is a role model for the child without direct communication. Now, the parent, by his or her own action, is a role model for the child. The child looks at the parent. That's what I want to be. So the first says like this: there's a difference between a boy and a girl. In the case of a girl, the mother has both functions. Now, she is the one who encourages the child, who maybe has to admonish the child, has to discipline the child, but she's also the role model for the child. Right? There's a little girl. Who should she look to for inspiration? Her mother. In the case of a boy, says Rav Hirsch, it's true that the mother is the one who's encouraging the child. What is she telling the child? Be like your father. Look at your father. He learns Torah. He goes to shul. He does all these wonderful things. He gives tzedakah. He's a nice man. Hopefully that's the case. So he says you should be like him. Right? So for a female child, the mother has a double mission. Right? For a male child, she has half the job. She is the one who is the primary caretaker, but she is not the role model. The role model is the father in absence. Let's tell you a funny story about how sometimes fathers fulfill this role even in absentia. A person once came to Chaim Kanievsky, I believe, and asked him the following shaila. In other words, I go to a Daf Yomi class, and I have a choice of classes to which I can go. I can go either to the early morning Daf Yomi, before davening, before work, or I can go to the evening Daf Yomi after work. So which one should I go to? So he says, what are the pros and cons? So he says, well, in the morning I'm wide awake, I'm fresh, I can listen to the shir, I pick up the Gemara. So at night I'm very tired after a whole day of work. I fall asleep in the class. So he says, so what's the question? Why should you want to go to the evening one? So he says, now the morning one is so early in the morning, says my kids aren't even up yet. They don't see that I went to learn. He says, at night, right, if I go to the shir, my kids see that I went to learn. Right? That's also very important. I don't end up learning anything. Right? So what should I do? So what did the Chaim Kanievsky say with the wisdom of King Solomon? He said, go to both. go to the morning shir to learn the Daf Yomi, go to the evening shir so your kids should see that you go to learn. But the truth is, that's an amazing thing, you see, that the father doesn't have to be around the house to be a role model. Right? If the mother can say, let's see, your father, he went to a shir, he went to Daf Yomi, that's also something, right? You can't leave the kids alone, right? When the kids are older, right, then they will take care of themselves. You can both tell them, says, listen, we both went to shir tonight, we're going to learn Torah, says, you'll mind the store, don't let any strangers in the house, we're going to learn Torah. That's a wonderful thing, right? People ask the parent, people call up, says, is this your father home? Says, no, he went to a class. Okay, is your mother home? She also went to a class. Right? It's a wonderful thing, right? What child wouldn't be proud to say that my parents went to study Torah? It's a beautiful thing. But up to a certain point, you have to have someone at home with the child. So if the father goes to the shir and the mother stays at home, but she says, I want to learn Torah. That's the inspiration. But the point is that's why the mother has much greater responsibilities for the little girl than for the little old boy. So therefore, in preparation for that mission, she has to prepare twice as long, twice as hard. So the period of preparation for the male child is only 40 days. For the female child is 80 days. But also we understand that extra sacrifice, the carbon ola. A carbon chatas is to remove a sin. Is to remove a sin. A person committed a sin, you want to remove the sin, expiate the sin, you bring a carbon chatas. Ola, it always means a greater level of attachment, something which is higher, something which is, you're uplifting yourself, you're bringing yourself closer to God. It says that's the difference between this instance and the case of the carbon ola v'yorei. There's a list of sins that if a person commits, the person has to bring a carbon chatas. Right? If a person made an oath and didn't keep it, or the person went into the Beis Hamikdash when he was in a state of ritual impurity, whatever, there's a list of sins which you bring a carbon ola v'yorei. So the fundamental obligation is a chatas. Now go, a sheep. You can't afford to go to a sheep, so you bring 2 birds. But there, even though one of the birds is an ola, it's not really an ola. It's really, as we said, it's to replace the fat of the chatas. the pair of birds, where one is a chatas and the second is an ola, really are both replacements for the chatas. Here, there's an obligation to bring an ola. Even if she has means, right, she brings a chatas and an ola. If she doesn't have means, she also brings a chatas and an ola, but both are birds. But the ola is an ola. It's not a replacement for the chatas. The ola is an ola. Because here, we're not talking about simply expiating a sin. Maybe there is a sin, like the Gemara Nida says, but there's something more over here. And this is the Oled that's preparing herself for her mission as the one who's going to raise this child. And therefore, she has to raise herself to a higher level. And that's why the obligation of an Ola is introduced specifically here.
It's maybe a silly question, but it seems to me you're making an argument that the father should also bring a sacrifice in the case of a male child, because he has 50% of that responsibility in preparation for it.
Now that's a good question. I don't know why there isn't an equivalent ritual, but I think that the difference is this. The difference is that okay, you're right. In theory, if the woman has to bring an extra 40 days preparation, so why, in the case of a male, not transfer to the father? Okay, that might be a point in whatever Hirsch says. But the point I think we have to take out of this is, if Hirsch's analysis is correct, it points to the fact that in our obligation as parents, we half of our child rearing we accomplish by direct instruction, guidance, admonition, and so on and so forth. Half we accomplish through modeling. Do as I say, not as I do, is not going to fly. It never worked. It doesn't work. But that's not what it means to be a Jewish parent. In other words, it has to be, half and half. Sometimes the child will not pick up the hints. It's not enough just to be a role model, right? You can't say, listen, I'm doing the right things, sooner or later he'll pick it up. No, you have to, sometimes you have to be explicit. You can't let the child figure out on his own. You got to tell him, this is what you have to do, and so on and so forth. But it has to be something which is consistent with your own conduct. It's said by many commentators in Pirkei Avos, we're learning Pirkei Avos, so it'll talk about a great sage and mention Hu Haya Omer, he used to say. Right? It'll talk about he studied under, he studied from this person, and he used to say this. So what is the meaning of that very odd phrase, Hu Haya Omer, he used to say? So one of the classic commentators says, Hu Haya Omer means that his very life declared this idea. Hu Haya Omer, he used to say his very being declared this idea. This wasn't simply something theoretical that sounds right, so he expressed it. But his whole lifestyle, his whole way he carried himself, the way he conducted himself, declared this statement to be true. They lived these mottos. So when you heard it from such a person, it wasn't just something which is theoretically correct, makes sense, but it was something that this person exemplified in his personal life. And that's certainly the goal we have to aspire to, whatever it is we want our children to be. If we are not that ourselves in our own lives, it's not going to be successful. The extent to which we are genuine exemplars of that value, will be the extent to which we'll be successful in transmitting them to the next generation. Okay, everyone.